to the panel discussion. My name is Akanksha Agrahari, and this panel discussion is going to be centered around the topic changing realities, stories, experiences, and their expression. Before the moderator takes over, I would like to give a brief discussion of our panelists and the moderator. First up, we have Rashna Mudraboina. Rashna is a transgender rights activist. Rashna is also the creator of the first YouTube channel for transgender rights issues called Transvision. Rashna also happens to be the head of the transgender department at HRLN, which is Human Rights Law Network. Next up, we have Amandeep Sandhu. Amandeep is an author and he has written various fictions and non-fictions. Previously, he has been nominated for many prestigious literary prizes, including the Hindu Literary Prize for Best Fiction, for his novel Roll of Honor, in which he has detailed the accounts of a Sikh boy who is residing in a military boarding school during the Khalistan movement. Panelist 3 is Urvashi Butalia. Urvashi is a feminist author, she's a publisher, and she's an activist. She co-founded Kali for Women, which is the first Indian feminist publisher. And she also authored the award-winning oral history, Other Side of Silence, Voices from the Partition of India. Next up, we have the moderator. Our moderator is Rupali Samuel. She graduated from Nalsar in 2015 and presently she is a Hickson Human Rights Fellow and is pursuing her LLM from Harvard Law School in International Human Rights and Feminist Legal Theory. Over to you, Rupali.
Thank you so much, Akanksha. It's lovely to be here and with many people talk about storytelling. And I just want to make some very initial remarks, but I don't want to take away any time from the amazing panelists that we have today. In relation to this topic, what I would like to focus on is storytelling from the margins and the many ways in which storytelling itself is an act of subversion. This is something that I cared about as a feminist scholar. It's something that I have to think about a lot as a practicing lawyer. And for me, it is one of the ways in which the act of storytelling can relates to what's going on in the world and sometimes the change that we may want to see in the world. So I want to start by thinking about how does one start telling a story and what are the ways in which one locates oneself in a story? What is your relationship? What is one's relationship to other stories? And how does one make space for many stories? So these are the questions that are important to me when we think about storytelling as an act of subversion. And I'd like to start from the personal and ask, what does it mean to find one's own voice as a storyteller? So for me, this is a really complex process, and the path of finding my own voice and finding my own truth is in itself for me a complex contestation between many stories. So I believe that we find, we find language through socialization. So we find language as beings that are already located in stories, in a set of norms, in worldviews, in dreams. And the language in which I speak and think already carries its own narratives, it carries its own stories. So in finding my own voice, the first thing that I need to be in conversation with are these narratives that I carry in language. So whether it's, what I understand beauty to mean, what I want to understand beauty to mean, and how so much of the language around beauty that I've learned is connected to a single notion of beauty that I may not ascribe to, but I still find myself in language when I start to describe something as beautiful. veering towards a certain direction, or even the notion of what love should look like, what love should be like, what being in love feels like. So much of that internal conversation is mediated for me by stories that I have read and seen around love, um, and what representations of love have been in the stories that I have viewed. So often these competing stories are not in sync with each other, and maybe not in sync with some of the instincts that I have, sometimes not in sync with wishes and dreams that I have, ways that I want to exist and be in the world. So definitely an early conflict was stories around gender and what gender is supposed to be as this extremely binary and fixed idea of roles that was not something that worked well with me at all. Uh, but at the same time, this process of navigating what I see my own gender as and how I want to express my gender is quite a complicated process. So my own internal voice, I find, is not solid. It is conflicted, it's contradictory, and sometimes I have instincts that don't really match the story that I want to tell about myself. So in this sort of complex terrain, finding one's voice is itself an act of storytelling to oneself. And in that act of storytelling, some stories have more power than others, and they stick or align with people in society who have power, and so they have a greater coercive impact on our lives. And more dangerously, some stories and some people who tell these stories um, claim to have a monopoly on their storytelling and on their worldview, and who claim this singular story as being the only way to be in the world, the only normal, or the only moral, or the only correct way of being in the world. And this becomes even more dangerous when people who have that worldview then have the power to disseminate that singular viewpoint in a hegemonic way through all the forms of media that we encounter in the world, social media, film, or practices, or model language. So so starting to think about storytelling from the margins is an internal conversation, uh, navigating the many stories in which we are socialized, navigating impulses, experiences, and dreams, finding voice for those impulses and wishes and dreams that don't fit the stories that we're socialized in, and then finding a way to bring those stories into a public sphere and into a world that has many hegemonic storytellers and narratives that disqualify these other ways of being and other ways of you know moving in the world. So I would say that the first way that I think about this process of subversion through storytelling is first having that internal messy conversation with myself, with people around me, and with people who don't neatly fit into the familiar world in which I'm socialized, and aiming to actually embrace this idea of multiplicity of stories, that there are really an infinite number of norms and roles and models and dreams, and trying to love and appreciate and embrace that kind of multiplicity. And then as a lawyer, trying to find a way to articulate that multiplicity in a world that's definitely very hierarchical and very singular in how it's designed. So just to give a very small little anecdote, one of the ways in which the singular voice of storytelling in the law is manifest is in the role of a judge who has to quite literally decide between the stories of various litigants before this person and decide who has the correct story, and the judge's version of the correct story then gets the coercive power of law as being the only form of the story that can exist and that has to be imposed on uh, the litigants before the courtroom. So the scholar Bob Cover called this process jurispathy, the killing of other people's stories by law or by a judge. And I find that idea very compelling. And one of the cases in which this became like so clearly manifest was the 377 litigation, where the Supreme Court initially said that it doesn't recognize non-normative sexualities. It does not believe non-normative people exist. It doesn't believe in queerness, and it doesn't believe in queer rights. And another Nalsar alum, Danish Sheikh, he wrote a play called Contempt that we were lucky enough to come to Nalsar and perform, where he took the voices of all the people that the court refused to see and had these people in the play speak their own story, and juxtapose this with excerpts from the actual transcript of the courtroom hearing, where judges were repeatedly saying, this is unnatural, we don't know this doesn't exist, this is minuscule, and that kind of stuff. So that was one attempt to like actually bring that multiplicity and imagine a court space that actually could fit that multiplicity of voices and experiences, and imagine a form of justice that could listen to all of these multiple voices, which I guess finally brings me to the other very difficult question, which is, how do you live and listen to stories? How do you listen to multiple stories, and how do you listen with an openness, um, especially when when my own truth feels so high stakes and in many instances feels so incontrovertible? So how can I make space to listen and hear someone else's truth and someone else's stories? And how can multiple stories not just exist, but exist together? So this is my negotiation and conversation around storytelling as an act of subversion. And with these very preliminary questions and reflections, I'd like to now invite the panelists to share a bit about what each of you thinks about storytelling in response to our world and what's going on in our world, and the new challenges that we have in the world. So Rachna, maybe if you could start, kick us off with how you see storytelling and what you want to do with storytelling.
Audible?
Yes, Rachna, I can hear you.
First of all, thank you for making the panel changing. visualize storytelling as a tool because something emerges true of your life and for transient from a very marginal under like, being attracted using sex work and fighting for my community. I feel that each and every such narrative of trans marginalized on those lines, like either gender or the working spaces, which is very confined to trans and mostly is taking off. And those and the stories are the really touching enough and are the of this society how the has been in political binary, how it has excluded a lot of human out of spectrum, you know, humanity. Starting from childhood, if we have to speak as a people trans narrative, then you will listen to the child rights. Child has been violated by their family, who disowned them in a very small age. Have to listen to those infringement of the right education in the school where gender non-conforming children have been bullied, being different, not being set into the stereotypical binary, or to those when the natal families children ended on the road and ended up in begging or either just to survive, to feel alive. And each and every narrative people, the working class, will speak this truth. This is of gender justice or our society, which everyone has to face. It's not I say that once or the you have to face this truth every day. You face this. Get those trans, but clapping feels very rude to them. Denuded themselves in front of those shops, taking for arms, taking arms, and just saying and leave. So I feel I come from such background. People who are dependent on taking my narrative is not different from and my fight and when come to my storytelling I very on very less platforms have been my life story or storytelling because I feel most of this marginal because I feel myself very privileged because I'm a I'm speak in English and I can interact with the virtual platforms on various lines. But I always made those stories of my fellow trans have been still marginalized, been still have no access to education, been still not have an access to the food, right to home or right to life. And the system have been designed, conceptualized on the lines period. Society, and we are part of the society because why we are not aiming by the need of binary. So a lot of human rights violations happen in between stories and almost all the stories it has a lot. And coming to me, my own story also started where I struggle as an independent trans man. It's also systemic, but I did it because because I have been always resisted this operation or exploitation with system also. So if you are you are from marginalized community, there is also you have to also know the system of patriarchy, how it in the so-called stereotypical gender binary system. So when women have been treated as a second gender, and we have been given a third gender status. So this patriarchal hierarchy, which has been designed in society, has always been pushed us and denied access to various systems. So our systems are designed, and that's how I have been resisted myself to into that system, and I wanted to be independent, and I want to my the fellow beings, trans people, and my coming next generation to be all very independent, get educated, get into employment, very voluntary, and with full liberty and equality, claiming their own equality, claiming their liberty in the society equal to other genders. So from my place of work of sex work, I have been resisted this, more worker, I have been into the various movements, women movement, Dalit movement, Muslim minority movement, every other single movement has been collective and have been part of. And we started the initial discussions, a dialogue, which we feel that will be go on consistently on a long-term basis. And we started this dialogue within the movements, people also to discuss the need of discussion of how we treat transgender rights equal or on par with the other people's rights or other marginalized communities. And as you all can feel and experience how the state repression has been worked all on these marginalized population or the people's movement, and the same thing has been effected, and where there have been a collectivization division of. We have seen that in a very, and often we have seen it as a tool of arm twisting by the powerful systems in society to divide the community, which has been the same trans community also. Because I feel trans community is the only community which has from ages and ages resisted the communalization. What I mean to say is, repeat it, trans community stand against the communalization. Okay, so we have crossed that when we leave, we cross our religion, we cross our caste, we cross our class, cross all those privileges which we have, like others have acquired through all these lines. So we have been exploring all, leaving behind, and but that doesn't mean that we have what marginalization we have been faced being coming from a marginalized caste has not touched us. That has been a second chapter, and many of us have been from marginalized background like Dalit, Adivasi, trans people, Haridus, exposed and has narrated those pains, double stigma, discrimination, which they have faced on the lines of caste and also on the gender. So, and very pathetically, this so-called and when we claim that there is a nation of various things, and we kept it on a very tight compartment, saying that and united everyone, living on the edges of the society, unitedly living under one roof, sharing the common resources, and we always get invited, and we have not been divided by religion or caste. Well, we have seen and we have been seeing in our generation division which has those lines have touched, which is very big, very big, and the narratives have been changed. So narratives which have been started on the marginalization on the lines of gender, and also exclusion from systems of employment, education, and the violence also have changed the narratives, shifting the shifting the perceptions based on how the power politics and same division we have seen and experienced. But still, we are trying hard. In that one fine day, that our community will reunite again, and the cross solidarities with the people will emerge more strongly out of this repression. And last but not least, I want to express only one out of our one specific because Nalsar plan. Quickly, I want to express one of my experiences for the storytelling of my lived experience. You can the and you all know 14 has been historical in the transformation of India. The apex goal. India has also versus uh, acknowledging the constitutional rights of transgender nation. Have led a long battle from 2016 when government want to bring the bill of transgender persons protection of rights bill 16, which goes on face of also India, a lot of visions and concepts which has been brought out of these judgment and go against this judgment, but we have fought a long battle from 2016 to 2019, which we made the mainstream society and also the stakeholders like the parliamentarians, the lawmakers, also the public, how important the narratives or the understanding or the perceptions of trans people or issues of trans people is important while we make a law for those community or a policy. So till when 2019 this so-called bill becomes the act and a so-called long battle, we have suggested to changes. Though didn't get that many changes, but at least we have curtailed the changes to seven. Those seven are very basic changes, which still we are fighting and still are pending. So instead of that, the government brought the rules and also rules are published in the Gazette. What I mean to say is that based on Nalsar, there have been long battles from 2014 till today on the state going and knocking the doors of High Court the implementation of. But still, there are very good judgments across the states in the High Court in favor to implement decision. They go on pending, they go on giving explanations, yet pending such decision, which was delivered by the respected High Court. So what I mean to say is that we need a long conversation on a sustainable with the mainstream society. That's how we envisaged and we come with in the YouTube channel called Transvision, where we speak with the public about the what is the importance of discussion of the issues of transgender rights and transgender issues, the public with a very positive attitude. Because unless until public discourse we have not brought and personal perceptual change we have brought on the transgender issue or the gender diversity, it's very tough that though we get very good judgments from the court and they will not be get implemented by the state because it's all the political game. So not taking much time and thanking once again for giving this precious time, I want to say that we need a continual talking or speaking of our narratives of trans people so that the mainstream stereotypical gender perceptualized society can go on beat with our challenges saying that gender is always have been diverse because it's as nature has been diverse, gender has been always diverse, and the society should see that diversity, should feel that diversity, should implement that diversity.
Thank you so much, Rachna. I now request if you can make your initial comments, and then maybe we can ask more specific questions after that.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I have uh, two or three things to say to start with. First of all, thank you, and thank you so much to Urvashi Butalia, ma'am. Uh, she has been extremely kind to me in my life. She endorsed my third book. We spoke about storytelling. Uh, I'll mention that. Uh, but I have a small request. Can I at least see one or two faces, please? Because I just don't know how to speak to a computer. Just a computer, you know. Thank you. Thank you very much. And third is, how much time do I have?
About 15 minutes.
Okay, so it is 4:40. I'll try to finish. Uh, stories. Well, I have always believed that all of us are stories. We all, life itself that we have writes itself each day, each moment. And the issue really with stories that we are is that when we either tell our stories um, or we hear stories, and our stories that we tell are well received with empathy, with understanding, with warmth, uh, we feel we are at home. When we hear stories in which we find ourselves and we again feel at home. Stories to me, language is home to me. Stories are home to me. But when the stories we tell are not received well, when they're twisted out of recognition, we feel uprooted. We feel we don't belong. We feel uh, uh, angry. We feel agitated. We feel like telling the story, but many a times the other side to whom we want to tell the story keeps denying us. Mm, I am, yeah, I write, but I don't consider myself too much of a writer really because writers are very fine beings. I'm also an activist. And if I have to give you an example right now, I'm very deeply involved in the farmers' protest going on. Look at what is going on for the last 53 days. The farmers are trying to tell a story, and they feel completely at home in those stories. The story is that the laws are wrong, and the government keeps trying to deny that story that they are telling. They keep dragging them into these 9 meetings have happened until now. Nothing has come out of them. They keep making statements that these are Khalistanis, these are rich farmers, these are Tukde Tukde gang, these are motivated by opposition. But none of that holds good because at least I feel, because I am part of the struggle, I feel that the truth is on the side of the farmers. But see what is going on in terms of storytelling in the country. The entire big media, the television media, does not support the farmers, keeps peddling the government version. Print media, some of it is trying to articulate what the farmers are trying to say, but most of the editorials of all newspapers do not give farmers space there. They actually are propagating the laws which the farmers have very convincingly proved are wrong, right? What did the farmers do? They first said, okay, this lapdog media, this what is called Godi media, don't come close to us. We don't want to talk to you. In fact, it is a good stand, I think, because instead of being misrepresented, it is better to not be represented. And parallelly, they have erected their own forms of storytelling. There is so much on what is called internet television. There is Twitter. They have created their own IT cell on Twitter, which has deflated the 7-year-old Hindutva propaganda IT cell completely. Not for a day, not for half a day, these 53 days has the narrative been with the government. The farmers' narrative continues to thrive purely because I feel there is an engagement with it, there is a personal concern with it. They are actually being able to put their point out. Whether the country believes it or not, whether the middle class wakes up or not, is a different question. That is a question that remains for every story that is told to you. Whether the country tends to believe that the previous story they had bought into, that this government is just perfect answer to all our solutions, that is a question that remains. But in terms of storytelling, it is really playing out in the nation right now. How do I come to this? And I come to this through my books and through my life. I was born in a family in which my mother was diagnosed with a mental health issue. I was sent to study away from the dysfunctional family in Punjab, which itself was dysfunctional in the 80s. There was militancy going on there, there were huge issues. And by the time I reached university, incidentally in Hyderabad, the University of Hyderabad, I really found myself completely broken. And I was broken because I didn't know how to tell my story. The narrative in the university, this was a time of literary theory just coming into departments. The narrative was caste, very important narrative. I completely agree with that narrative. But I belong to an upper caste who's supposedly upper caste in Punjab. So I couldn't be a Bahujan. The other big narrative was women, and that is very important as well. But I can't belong to it because I'm of the wrong gender. So even through university, I didn't know what to do. Where do I find myself? I'm understanding, I'm empathizing with the struggle of everybody else who is speaking here, all the stories that I'm listening to, but I don't find myself in those stories. And I don't know how to tell my story. So I would actually sit in front of white pages and cry because I didn't know how to write. You know, when I started writing, the first story I naturally wrote was, which became the book Sepia Leaves, which is about mental illness. And it had a long struggle to get published. But when it did get published, the response I got from, and till date, I mean, 13 years later, I still get the same response, is just two words: thank you. And I'm like, why are you saying thank you? And they say, we are saying thank you because we found ourselves in your story. And who were these people responding? These were caregivers to those who are mentally ill. Now, in a separate session on mental health writing, we can talk about it. But basically, the caregiver is the least enfranchised person in the system of medical health. Of course, the patient is suffering. The patient is the victim. The patient does not, many a times, in fact, the law also does not look at them kindly. They are insanity. If you look at history of civilization, has been a clause to discredit anybody. It continues till today, you know. But it is the caregiver who is functional, who could have their own life, who could have their own aspirations, but they are through love, dedication, a sense of bond, they family, they are dedicated to taking care of the person who is suffering. And all these caregivers wrote back to me and they said, thank you. You gave us a story in which we belong. And I'm telling everyone, please write your own stories. At that time, we had not had stories on mental health, especially in the country. There was Dom Moraes' great book, of course, but I read a lot of mental health literature, and I said, everywhere, as Foucault says, madness becomes a spectacle. Or as Nietzsche says, or Socrates before that says, madness becomes a divine inspiration. The artist is mad, but I'm like, no, madness is nuts and bolts. Madness is vomit and blood. Madness is broken windows and broken tables. Madness is gritty, grimy, it is ugly. Let's talk about the ugliness of it also. So when you talked about art, I'm like, art, like ugliness is art, or maybe reality is art, or maybe just telling what you're really seeing is art. I was thinking of Walter Benjamin when you said his great book called Art. I think it's called Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. He was actually writing about Nazi Germany, and he was saying, what can the power give to the cadre who is standing up for this kind of a fascism? They can give them drama, they can give them music, they can give them, parades, because they can't pay these cadres, So he was writing in that context about what art does. But art, even in general life, we look at it, it's not only pleasing beauty, it can also be devastating things. And much of our writing, much of Rachna's work is actually about the devastations we are going through. Okay, So I got confidence to write, and then I told, okay, I'll tackle the next big subject in my life again, which was growing up in Punjab in 1984. And I mean, there is militancy going on, there is separatism going on. I'm studying in a military school, trying to join the military, and I don't know suddenly what am I more? I'm both, but what am I more? Am I a Sikh or am I an Indian? Because here the Indian army has destroyed the Sikh sanctum sanctorum. And so that book is about that confusion. But actually, in that confusion, I saw the role in a boarding school of that nature that sex plays, and I wrote about that as well. Give me a half a second. I'm a slave to my cat called Shaheen, and this is her lunchtime. And I named her Shaheen. I named him Shaheen because he came during the Shaheen Bagh protests. Uh, but when I took that book to Jamia to do a reading, a student from Jamia asked me, "Would the people you write about find themselves in your book?" And I said, "Now this is also an aesthetic. This is also something that a writer should be able to do. If you're writing about people, then those people should find themselves in your book." I took it as a sort of a mantra for me, and I attempted this third non-fiction book, which Urvashi ma'am saw. And she said to me, she said, after she read it, she said, the book is heartfelt, it's honest, it has done a lot of groundwork, there's been a lot of, but it does not do justice to the woman question of Punjab. And I'm like, absolutely right. And I'm now once again trapped in my gender, and I felt that I say it, she said, put that in towards the end of the book. I put it in also because it is so important that who are we trying to write about? I really feel that the most I can write about is only myself. I can't even write about my cat. I can't even write about anybody else. I can only, if possible, I was at the protests for 15 days last week. Before that, I've been trying to articulate the protests. I can only feel that you can go, you can sense the land, you can pay homage to it, you can put your head down there, learn, listen, smell, come back and try to put it in words. And again, going back to the protests, I mean, it is so brilliant the way the women have come out in this protest. It is so brilliant the way the caste divide has been bridged in this protest. But how much justice can you do? And if you can't do justice, then I think the only way your work can speak is if you remain 150% self-reflexive about what you're writing. That you confess to the reader that, okay, this is something which is not my area. This is something which I am also grappling with. Tell them how you are grappling with it. The reader will understand that grappling. The reader will then start grappling with it. That is a way of doing this. It's not that you can't write about things that are outside of you, but I think the most you can do is you can write the struggle of trying to understand and tackle that is around you. And in the process, if your learning transforms you, then you can bring about this understanding of what is your own transformation, and that could perhaps help others transform. So again, going back to the original is stories in which we find ourselves, stories which are well received from us, are the stories that satisfy us. Stories that are misinterpreted, stories where we are misrepresented, stories which are twisted out of recognition, they remain disappointing. They create angst. They create depression. Punjab, the book I wrote, I saw a huge incidence of mental health there. I saw a huge incidence of breakdown of the narrative itself there. And I think our job as practitioners of language is to be able to use language to give dignity to everyone, to not only ourselves, not only our oppressors, but to make language bear upon the dignity of everyone who is involved in a struggle. And life is a struggle, the world is a struggle. And if we do it honestly, I think we make sense. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amandeep. Now I finally would like to invite Urvashi to share your thoughts.
Thanks so much, Rupali. Thank you to Nalsar for asking me to come here. And it's a delight to listen to all three of you. So I'm going to, and what Amandeep didn't tell you was that I actually did what people of my age do. I gave him a dart and said, where are the women in this story? How can you write about Punjab? He's being polite. Tell you, how could you write about Punjab without the women? And then I suggested that he put something in at the end at least. I am going to talk from the point of view, or not of being a writer or a storyteller, but more a publisher who receives different kinds of stories, and a teacher who's the staple of whose teaching is made up of stories. So that's really where I'm coming from. And I'm going to begin by telling you some stories, since this is a session about storytelling. The first two such stories come from the middle of the 19th century. You may well know them. One is the story of a young 14-year-old woman, young Dalit woman called Muktabai. And the other is a story that comes from the life of a woman I'm sure you'll have heard about, Savitribai Phule. So as you probably know, Savitribai, her husband Jyotiba, and a friend of hers called Fatima Sheikh ran schools for women in Maharashtra, where women, widows, Dalit women, and others could study. And it was at this school that Muktabai was able to get an education otherwise denied to Dalits. So it was here that, as part of a competition, she wrote an essay which denounced the ways in which the upper castes, more specifically the Brahmins, had denied education to Dalits. This essay was later published, and today, for those of us who study the history of women's consciousness, this is one of the earliest documents that tells us about histories of gender and caste. Muktabai, at the age of 14, she raised important questions about why Dalits should be subjected to the so-called rules laid down by the Vedas if they were denied knowledge of the Vedas, and why they were not allowed to get an education. These two women's stories, that is Savitribai's and Muktabai's, come together in interesting ways. So just as the upper castes were intolerant of Dalits wanting to get an education, so also they were angry with people who provided them this education. So Savitribai, who went against this and worked hard to set up schools and provide an education, and there's a story about Savitribai that I often tell my students, and that goes like this, that every day when she walked to work to teach, she would be verbally attacked and sometimes also physically attacked by people on the street who did not like what she was doing. They would hurl abuse at her, often throw rotten vegetables at her, with the result that by the time she reached the school, her sari, which she was wearing, would be all soiled and dirty. And so she came up with a solution. She decided that she would wear one sari and carry another with her to school so that she could change into the clean one and do the teaching. So on the face of it, these are just two stories, but let's stop and ask what they tell us. So to me, both these stories, Muktabai's and Savitribai's, are precious ways to understand that which conventional history doesn't give us, because conventional history doesn't work with the tools that allow us to hear anything other than the mainstream narrative, as all of you have pointed out, the stories of the powerful and not those from on the ground, certainly not those of women or Dalits, Bahujans like Savitribai and Fatima Sheikh who gave them support, and others. But in order to hear what these stories are telling us, we too, that's we, the readers and listeners, as people who receive these stories, I think we need to change the ways in which we read and we listen. And if we do that, our ways of understanding our pasts become so much more nuanced, so much more meaningful. So for me as a feminist, Savitribai's soiled sari and the clean sari she carried is a source of history. In other words, as opposed to documents that are meant to provide what's it called hard evidence or factual evidence, we have a piece of cloth, a sari that tells us about history. It allows me to understand in ways that no historical account will do the levels of opposition to Dalits receiving an education, the ways in which this was resisted and subverted, as in Muktabai's outspokenness, Savitribai's courage, Fatima Sheikh's solidarity. So the story of a sari or that of a short essay by a young woman can act as a valuable tool to understand history and our pasts, and therefore equally valuable tools to take us into the future. Now let me move to my second story. This is a story from the time of partition. As many of you know, I have worked on partition and I've kind of become the partition lady who receives all kinds of stories that people send to me, rather like bag ladies who stand around in parks and collect things in all kinds of bags. So some years ago, I was at a literature festival in Karachi and participating in a panel on partition. There, I met a woman called Shehnaz, and later I went to visit her home, and she told me her story. And this is how it goes. So Shehnaz was originally called Gurbachan. She belonged to a Sikh family. During partition, as her family and community fled from what became Pakistan to what became India, they were attacked and many people were killed. Shehnaz and a number of her friends, 5 or 6, I'm not quite clear how many, were abducted, very likely raped. Later, as happened with many women, Shehnaz's abductor married her. And together they had 5 children. Once she married, she converted to Islam and became Shehnaz, leaving behind the identity of Gurbachan. In the early 60s, she and her husband heard in Pakistan through a visitor that her parents were actually still alive, that they had escaped the attack, and they were now living in a place near Amritsar. So at her husband's encouragement, Shehnaz came to Amritsar to find her parents, and there was a reunion. Complications began when she was ready to return to Pakistan because then her parents refused to let her go back. They told her that her husband could go, but not she, and certainly not with that man. And finally, the husband left, taking all the children with him. Shehnaz was now made by her parents to reconvert to her original religion, and she became Gurbachan again. She was then married by her parents to a Sikh widower who had one young son, whom she now looked after. In Pakistan, meanwhile, Shehnaz's husband also married again, and his wife looked after his 5 children from his marriage with Shehnaz. Many years later, after Gurbachan, Shehnaz, whatever, her husband died, that is her Indian husband, she moved to the US with her son. And it was there that they began talking about her past life. And the son realized how much his mother yearned for her original family. He decided to help her and to see if they could find her family. They put an advertisement in a local Pakistani paper, and by some miracle, the family saw it. They made contact. The rest, as they say, is history. For Gurbachan, now went to visit her 5 children. They were now in their 50s and 60s and no longer children, but she had not seen them for 50 years. When she last met her son, who was the youngest of her children, he was 2.5 years old. And when I met her, she had come to see them and had decided that she wanted to spend the rest of her life with them. She became Shehnaz again, and she said to me, "This is my family, this is where I belong, this is where I want to die. I will stay on in Pakistan." Whether or not she was allowed to do so is another story, but this is what she said. So really then, what do we learn from this story? To me, this story has so many resonances for the present, and I say this because I know that one of your key concerns behind the kind of questions you're asking in this festival and in the discussions that you're having is how to carry our understandings of our pasts into our present and indeed into the future. So let me just point to a few things that become clear to us from just this one story. The question of citizenship for women, for where do women belong? How do we establish their claims to citizenship, to their identities? We know, for example, from the discussions on the NRC in Assam, how women are so deeply vulnerable because they are so devalued, that records of their identity do not exist, either in their natal families or in their marital families. They are either daughter of or wife of. How can this troubling question be resolved? How can law and policy, which only deal with certainties, deal with the ambivalences of people's lives? My sense is that stories like Gurbachan Shehnaz's story alert us to these complexities. They tell us how women's identities are shaped often by things outside their control, such as marriage. And they tell us how important it is to listen to women's voices, to listen to all voices, to listen to particularly those whose voices come from the margins. So in Shehnaz's story, the most important thing, I think, is the choice that she makes for her own life at the end about where she wants to be and where she wants to belong. Can law, for example, since many of you are lawyers, take into account such choices? We don't really know. But can the making and implementation of law recognize that such choices, such ambivalences exist in people's lives? And can its practice be informed by these? Rupali, in her introductory notes, referred to this, talking about the judge's acceptance of one narrative as a singular narrative of any case which is extremely complex. And can the practice of law be informed by these complexities? Perhaps it can. And if it can, that would be of a great deal of help to us. So let me try to bring what I'm trying to say to a close with some thoughts. I do think quite strongly that the importance of stories, of literature in the study of law and other such disciplines cannot be understated. Listening to the complex experiences of people's lives helps us to bring nuance and depth to the otherwise arid terrain of the disciplines that we inherit in academia. Stories teach us something that will stand us in good stead in the future. That is the need and importance of listening. This is something that I think we all too often forget. For example, and Amandeep referred to this, what are the thousands of farmers sitting at our borders saying to the state? They are asking a basic question. Why didn't you talk to us before you made these laws? These are about our lives. Why are you not listening to us? Why are you treating us as if we don't know what's good for us, for ourselves? What were the women of Shaheen Bagh and many similar protests saying to the state last year? The same thing. Listen to us. We have concerns too. This is what the act of listening and the act of reading stories and literature brings to our world. Does it also bring complexity? Yes. And that's not a bad thing. I know that one of your concerns, as described in your background note, is change in the ways issues are seen and understood. And when I was reading that note, I wasn't entirely sure why that should be a cause for worry. Because of course things change. Of course, some things we may have fought for in the past seem completely out of sync today in the changing realities. But for me, the thing really is, if we see change as the only constant in our lives, then we'll also understand the need to keep up with it. So let me end by giving you an example from our own learnings as feminists. Many years ago, when we were fighting for changes in the law on sexual assault and rape, it was we women, I was among those women who argued for not revealing the name of the rape victim or survivor. Today, with many women who have lived through sexual assault standing up and proudly saying, why should I hide? Why should I be the one who has to hide? This change that we had thought of as so necessary at the time somehow seems to be in question. So what do? Do we decry the change we asked for years ago, or do we acknowledge that realities have changed, contexts have changed, and so must we, and so must law, in order to keep pace with the changed realities? And surely that is a step towards the future. I mean that in the end, all we can do is to look back at our histories, to recognize the lessons they have to offer, to be sensitive to what we hear, to what people say, and to work towards change, taking that knowledge and its complex lessons with us. So, this is what, if you will allow me to make a plug for feminism, as that's where I come from, this is what feminism has always done. It's kept a door open for new learnings, new challenges, new experiences. None of this means we let go of the things that are our basic non negotiables. For example, human rights, a cessation of violence, respect for human beings, to name only three. And as to the future, as you yourselves have said, for that, perhaps we can only speculate, and maybe we can turn to speculative fiction. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Urvashi. We've had some really interesting and intriguing thoughts from our three panelists. So I'd like to invite all those listening in to share questions on your chat boxes, and I'll be more than happy to put those questions to our panelists. I'm sure you have a lot of interesting reflections that you may want to share as well. So please do enter that in the chat box. And in the meantime, when people are putting in their questions and reflections, I'd like to ask any of the panelists to ask questions of each other if there are questions or reflections that you have. And if, since the conversation, if there's a response that you have or thoughts that you have to what your other panelists have said. So maybe we can go in order. Rachna, is there anything that you'd like to ask Amandeep or Urvashi or share about what they've said?
I think I'm audible. I would like to answer the question. Someone is putting the question now, saying that what are your views on the same-sex marriages on regard to LGBT? What I feel is
Okay, sure.
that
Rachna, sorry, the audio is a bit soft. Is there any way that you can come closer to the mic, or
My headphones. Hope I'm audible now.
yeah, this is much better. Yeah,
Okay. Then what
go
I
ahead.
mean to say is that uh, what is the position of, or what are the views of LGBTQI movement on the same-sex marriage? So we need to know the historical preference of or the historical fight of the queer movement of this nation, where we have been consistently want to decolonize the queer movement of this country, because the long queer pride marches which we do every year have been identified because as a part of the Western culture which most of the Indian communities celebrate or do. That was not the reality, and that's how we started in Telangana, the Hyderabad Queer Swabhimana Yatra. We decolonized everything. We have done the Bonalu, we have done the Batkama and everything which has been part of the culture, and we have been existed as a part of the culture every time the queer people have been. What I mean to say is that the historical background of the whole legal fight, legal battle of the queer movement of this nation have been based on with very much of the NGOs who've been sprouted or have been with backed with the HIV funding. Like, so what I mean to say is that if this fight has been started on the terms of a human rights perspective, the narrative might have something different, what I feel. So the marriage rights, what I feel, where in the contemporary people's movement, there is also a consistent dialogue going on the marriages. You know, mostly when you look at the women movement, there are more perceptual change around the marriage, whether it can be the marriage or the divorce or the violence or the living relationship, everything has the narratives has been changed on along with, and the women. Sorry. Am I back now?
Yes, you're back.
What I mean to say is that we have been seeing the narratives where women have been saying that now marriage is not an important institution which we want to just confine into. So as a queer movement, we have learned a lot of things actually. It's not only women who wanted to be not wanted to be into the marriage institution because it restricts a lot of our movement or liberty or the rights of women in those institutions and in those patriarchal systems. It's also the queer people who wanted their liberty and their independence around living together. What I feel to say that, and marriage has uh, I feel not the priority of, because this have been always been a colonized idea or the backup of the queer movement, which has been mostly run by the NGOs, and we need to see on terms of the people's movement who have been unfunded and who have been collectivized only on the terms of human rights. What I feel is necessary to look at to look at the marriage rights on those perspectives. What I mean to say is that there is no wrong in nothing wrong of having a marriage right, though the court have during the hearing of 377 decriminalization, the judges themselves told that the civil rights will be dealt later, and they will be dealt, and people are just knocking the doors of courts continuously saying that we need marriage. But what I mean to say is that it's not in the top priority list of the queer community or the LGBTQI community when come to the movement, whereas we are still in involving or raising or indulging into the a dialogue, consistent dialogue with the society, how decriminalization can be practiced in our real lives. Okay, I give an example. When you look at the social networking sites like Tinder, Grinder, where our queer people have been continuously put into violence, they have been kidnapped, they have been blackmailed for what being them, and they have been denied by their own natal families, they commit suicides, and there are more suicides. We see that there is a consistent struggle with the society, society, for accepting our reality, being an LGBTQ person, So when itself, the identity itself has been into crisis, though the apex court has been decriminalized the same-sex relationship, the society doesn't have shifted their perception towards that. So without involving the society into this, consistent dialogue of how we can make the tangible, the decriminalization, stepping into the marriages and marriage rights, I feel they are very much secondary. What I feel. So people who want the marriage, definitely they can marry, but we look at this as if our narrative around the marriage has been changing within other movements, then we also need to look at the options of whether we being queer people can live together without the institution of marriage, and still our privacy, still our right to living can be protected or not. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachna. Before we go to the other audience questions, and if you are coming in now, I want to once again give the opportunity to the panelists to put questions to each other if that's what you want to do.
I have a question to Urvashi, but a very small one. It's which year did Gurbachan come back to Amritsar, to her parents' place?
62. 62 or 63, thereabouts.
She had lived around 15 years in Pakistan.
Yeah. Rupali, could I respond a little bit to the issues that Rachna has raised?
Yes, of course. Please.
Amandeep, have you finished your question, or did you want to ask more?
Yeah, I finished, but I'll come back to another response but later. But please go ahead, ma'am.
Okay. So, Rachna, I just wanted to say thank you so much for what you just said. And in some ways, to me, you actually answered your own question towards the end of what you were saying, by talking about the ways in which society needs to understand the humanity of trans people and queer people, and to see their desire to live in relationships with each other, or their expression as within quotes normal. I only wanted to go back to your first point when you were talking about marriage, to say that, even, within the women's movement, there are actually a range of views on marriage. Partly, of course, there is a critique, a very strong critique of marriage as a patriarchal institution, which locates women in very specific ways and which can be very oppressive and often violent towards women. But there is also a recognition that many women who are feminists are within marriages, and that the relationship in those marriages is very complicated by the fact that the power equations, the way power plays out in marriages, it plays out often simultaneously with love or with affection or with attachment, either to the husband or to your children or whatever. And then within feminism, within Indian feminism or within the women's movement, there have been organizations and strong efforts to reform marriage laws. So Christian Marriage Act was reformed after 10 years of activism by Christian groups. Similarly, there is a model Nikah Nama in Islam, and there have been discussions about reforming the Hindu Marriage Act, and so on and so forth. So in a sense, the feminist response to the institution of marriage is a complex response and has many things in it. And I think while that critique of marriage may carry through into the queer desire or wish for marriage, which is a legitimate demand to recognize close relationships and not have to hide them, but I don't think the need for a relationship and to be able to articulate and have that relationship openly is something that's questioned at all. And I think that we need to just recognize that actually we are all allies in this, and there may be differences among us also, but we also need to come together on those. So I just wanted to put this before you, that there are many complexities in the ways marriage is looked at within women's groups also.
I
Want to
totally agree
respond
with
to yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Can I go ahead?
I think Rachna was going to
Yeah,
respond.
you're saying something. Yeah.
Rachna, did you
No,
want to?
no, absolutely. I agree with the Urushi madam, what she said. And except the thing is like, yeah, we also have been, yeah, there is an extended solidarity with the women movement, Dalit and minority movements also. And we have been in our real time experiences have been, mostly I can speak out of my trans narratives, where our trans sisters have been into and proper marriage into system. Either it can be Hindu marriage or the Islam or the Christian marriage. But though they have no that, though don't have the proper rights, marriage rights, even they practice them, and they have been into these systems as a women, as a proper women, as a cis women, and somehow the society has been pushed back them again to get marginalized on those lines, and whether it can be violence within partner relationship, or it can be it can be what you say, like a violence within the house or the marriage life. So what we feel like, we have been doing a consistent dialogue with the main movement also, how we can relook at into the laws of which are very which are the main laws of women, can be articulated on the lines of trans people or the LGBTQ
Yeah,
people,
very
if at all they are going to be into the institution of marriage actually. So we have been in a consistent dialogue of that. And apart from that, I agree everything with the Urvashi. Thank you.
Thank you.
Amandeep, did you want to come in as well?
I wanted to go back to the original what you stated is the danger of the single story. Now, what would that imply? You know, it would imply that multiple stories are good, but how many are multiple? You know, and as per somebody has even asked that question to Urvashi ma'am, but I'll also interject in that. It's like, uh, where do you draw a line? Where do you draw a line on truth? You know, or what seems authentic, at least to you? And I faced this issue when I went to research 3 years, travel Punjab, and I sat and listened to hundreds of people, recorded many hundreds of hours of interviews. At the end of it, my brain was like bangan ka bharta, you know, like I didn't know what to make out because um, everybody has a take. And when years are distressing, when you've not been heard, you know, and you have been internally monologuing to yourself, then there is much angst that comes out, and everybody wants to take 2 hours, 3 hours. They want to, you know, keep you and tell you the whole story. You know, they think that at least somebody say, you know, somebody is listening to us, and I was that listener, and I listened. But even if you look at politically, I'm changing the topic from a very important one on gender and transgender rights to the political sphere of Punjab, which is what the book really is about. Politically, you realize that people are more or less divided into three groups, you know, and the first is the Hindus of Punjab. I mean, there is so much narrative about Sikh and Sikh angst and all that, but we must not forget that it was the Hindus with whom the violence started first. Then there is the left groups of Punjab, you know, who took a very different position from what is called the Sikh right wing, though I don't agree with that definition, but the Panthic view, what is called, it's an English word now, the Panthic view of Punjab. And these were the three sort of corners. Everything that was being spoken fell into one or the other of them, but they were mutually at loggerheads with each other. And I'm not making a pitch for the book, but what I'm saying is that when I managed to write the book, it drove me to depression. This quest of what is true, what should be written, right? But when I finally presented the book, I was very happy to see that all three groups agreed with my narration of it. And that narration is basically open-ended. And the core to that answer the question there is, where do you draw the line on truth? You know, I personally believe there is nothing called truth. Everything is subjective. Everything has to go through the prism of our own selves. We ourselves are multiple selves. We have to make sense to of something ourselves, be able to articulate, and then it manages to go through to people. And other people do have points of view, and those must also be admitted. You know? So the three groups were satisfied, but the two groups, again, now ma'am said it, so what ma'am scolded me about was gender and caste. You know, these were the two groups that were still not addressed adequately in it. And in fact, it has been my work since the book has been done that I'm trying to find, you know, people who can write on gender and caste on Punjab, because it is so important to tell these many stories of the place. So, in terms of narrative or in terms of single truth is definitely never good, but too many multiple truths can also drive you into depression unless you know how to deal with it. Thank you.
Urvashi, do you want to respond to that, or?
Actually, I think Amandeep, rather like Rachna, has answered his own question by starting by saying no single truth and then talking about the three perspectives that he found and how people found those reflecting their stories. Then people will make their own judgments after that. So I think he's answered his own question.
Okay, I'm going to take you back to one of your stories, because some listeners have put in questions about that story, which is a really, truly a fascinating story. So we have a question here which says, the story of Shehnaz was one of its kind. Like in her story, she chose to take a step back and do what her family asked. But what about the husband who was in Pakistan? What can we learn from him? chose not to fight, or maybe chose to keep aside his happiness by leaving Shehnaz in India, because he clearly helped Shehnaz in meeting her family. But what did he get for his, in quotes, goodness?
Okay, thanks for that question. It's obviously a somewhat complicated story. I only got the husband story at second hand. I didn't, Shehnaz, I was able to speak to. The husband story is a complex one, in the sense that he's supposed to have been the abductor. Although in the family narrative, and this is what Shehnaz said, but her children said that he actually rescued her from abductors, which is a narrative that many children would want to have about their father. So I don't know how true or untrue that is. Also, that Shehnaz's Gurbachan, when they kept her back, her parents said she could keep the children but not the man, and he said he wasn't going to leave the children, and so he went away with the children and he remarried. But yes, you're quite right. He was a good man because he's the one who actually brought her, helped her to come. So it also, that story throws our notions of who's good, who's bad into complete kind of confusion, because if he was indeed the abductor and the rapist, and then they had a happy marriage, what does that tell us about violence and sexual assault? He brought her and he went back. What does that tell us about him as a person and what he thought of? And we don't really have answers to those questions. Because as I said, I got her story from her, but couldn't talk to him.
Urvashi, we have another question for you, which is Alia asks, individual stories, memory could fall prey to internalized prejudice. So how do we frame credible history from subjective narratives?
You might ask that question in the opposite way, that how do we frame credible histories from what pretends to be objective? Because that too is an interpretation of somebody's. As Rachna, what she was talking about, as Amandeep's stories tell you, that individual stories can differ, they are subjective, but somewhere the truth, and I use the word within quotes as Amandeep also used it, of understanding any situation lies, I think, in looking at the so-called objective alongside the so-called subjective, because it's the subjective that actually gives nuance, feeling, a sense of a moment which the objective can't capture. So, I mean, for example, we have let me take you somewhere completely different, workforce participation rates of women in India. If you look at them statistically, the statistics show us that workforce participation rates have dropped drastically in India and are lower than in any other country in South Asia, possibly comparable with Pakistan. What does that tell us? When you look around you at the reality, women are working all the time, everywhere, 24/7. So unless you understand the nature of women's work and how that is not captured by that data, and that understanding is a subjective understanding, you're not going to understand the statistical stuff, which is as false as any singular narrative can be accused of being. So I feel very strongly about looking at the two together and having one inform the other, which gives us an understanding of what's actually happening. I hope that helps to answer your question in some way.
Rachna, we have a question for you, which is about the start of your channel, Transvision. How did you build trust? People come and share their stories. And I just want to add a little to that question. In your TED talk, I remember you describing how initially you saw very violent and transphobic videos on YouTube, and that was part of the reason you made the decision that you want to have your own voice there to talk about yourself and talk about have various trans people be able to come and speak, um, and drown out in some way this negative representation. So when there is this divide in the online space, how do you also try to build dialogue with people who do not think the same way, or who do not respect you in the way that you want, where when you also
That's a
have
very relevant question.
to,
And
you know,
yeah.
yeah.
So am I audible now?
Yes, Rachna, yeah.
So that's a very relevant question, and also I feel the connecting question what Urushi ma'am has answered, that could the individual stories could fall prey to the internet's prejudice. What I feel is that the marginalization is the truth of our lives. When we narrate our stories, it's the truth we narrate. And the truth, what I mean is the pain or the grief or the anger or the happiness what we have experienced. That's what we narrate actually. And we should not forget that a single story of a trans woman or a man or a marginalized person is the outcome of the systematic dezoning or disagreement or exclusion, you know the systematic exclusion and marginalization. So we are part of this bigger excluding or the hierarchical patriarchal structure, which we all should accept with that truth first of all. And that's how the prejudice or of internalizing the single life stories cannot be arise, because at the end of at the end of the day, what I feel is, if a sex woman narrates the marginalization, saying that she has been into sex work to feed her children and to run her family because her husband has no work, and that's the reality. That's how system has put women also in such place. And that is what with even trans people also, so those are the truths. And when we are listening or reading the truths or the life stories of the people who are marginalized, they are coming out of and speaking out of their own realities. And we have to on par correlate them with the greater system which excluded these communities or these people's voices. That's what we have started with our voice, like our conversation also, that why farmers voice has been not listened, why Muslim women voice has not been listened, and why trans people's voice has not been listened when making policies or laws. And coming to your question, that how transvision uh, able to be more polite or responsible. Um, my answer could be little, weird, I feel like, because and whatever the language we used in the transfusion is a very respectable and polite language, which the mainstream society follow or have been conceptualized the whole media itself. What I mean to say is that, for example, the mainstream media, how it has been excluded from a long run, if say that excluded in also policy making or decision making the northeast people for a long time. I think you all will agree with that. Altogether, we feel that northeast is not at all part of India, and they have been never been involved in decision making. Okay, so called the progressive movements also, people's movements also have not seen those voices, and similar to other marginalizations also. So in the media also, and the real voice and the real pain, the real grief or the power of the community, and their voice has not been accepted because it was always treated as uncultured and antisocial mostly. So the history of trans people in this nation, they have been counted in the crime. They used to be in the list of the denotified tribes, and that's how the Hyderabad Eunuchs Act have been in place, and which has been now challenged. And we have been counted in the crime, and we have been in the numbers of criminals.
And that's how I felt very bad. And you're also then coming on YouTube and talking all the bad perceptions and all the myths and misconceptions about trans people, which can be translated into actions as a violence on trans people. Often we ignore whatever comments, whatever bullying, whatever harassment happens to women, and that's how it translates into the violence towards women. In a similar manner, there is no single media which has been articulated the what the bullying of trans people, gender non-conforming people, or the trans people will lead to at the end of the day. And most of the time it will be to get translated into an action, and that action can be more violent or harassment or bullying of a person. It can be starting from your home to the street. And this is what the challenges which have been sprouted actually when I have been starting transvision. So we have to talk, we have to be a parrot, and we have to talk the language of the society to make them read, to make them learn their own politeness, how to be more respectable to the fellow human being. So that's how we have envisaged the transvision, and we started the speaking the same language which society can understand and maximum of the society people can understand. And that's how we have been largely accepted, largely respected also. But that doesn't mean that in future, like transmission will not be confined to this respectable language itself, but we may also shift on to those narratives or those languages which have been unheard in the mainstream media. For example, I feel most of the time the tribal trans people's voice have been never heard, on the mainstream media or YouTube channel. Nowhere you found them, like, and people really don't know that there are such voices. So we're now planning to the various diverse voices to be heard in their own voice, in their own, and those are the real and their living realities and the stories of them to be brought into the light, saying that, and that's what they feel. And often, last but not the least, what I want to say, often we feel that so-called civilized media or civilized society have been opening their doors to accept trans people and taking into their folds. And this always hurts me, these narratives, whenever anyone started like saying that we have been more now positive towards trans, right? No, not at all. If you are working on the lines of religion, again we are going back to those roots only, which basis on your work, based on your gender, has been put us in a hierarchy. And mostly trans people have been excluded, not even hierarchy, they have been excluded in the whole system itself. So what I mean to say is that so these myths and misconceptions, and also the language which hurts or translate into actions as a violence towards trans people, can be only challenged when we go on making a perceptual change of the mainstream society, and hitting their views and hitting the perceptions with the videos or the audios, whatever we have done, whatever we do on, and we show them if we feel is important. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachna. I want to ask a follow-up question. When you see yourself and Transvision as representing so many more people who have experienced something similar, that's a lot of responsibility. And Amandeep has already expressed some anxiety around the responsibility of telling stories on behalf of many other people who kind of rely on you to be the voice. So, how do you feel about that responsibility that you carry? Does it also stress you out, or how do you think about that?
Oh, that's a very important question, and also important truth which everyone need to know. Actually, the way we work in Transvision, we are the teamwork actually. So we are the team of trans people or the queer people which come together, and it's our teamwork actually, team ideas we put. And whatever we show in the show, or whatever we translate into the videos, are not one singular idea. It's the pool of ideas, or it's the pool of advices
and pool of technical efforts we put in into the video. And that's how we from the working class, and the most of the trans people are from working class. For example, one hijra woman who have been she has done the half of day in begging. She come in the evening to our transfusion office, and she allotted 1 hour, and she'll be paid for that, and put her ideas into those videos. That's how the reality and the real voice of the community and their own experiences and the solution for that, what exactly the trans people expect from the society, have been replicated into those videos. So that's how always the teamwork has been put into the into our work, and has been depicted, and we are very thankful to our own all team members.
Thank you, Rachna. We have a question. The question is, where does an outsider fit in regards to any issue? Understandably, they cannot have a say in the matter, but what is their role? That's the question. And I want to add to that question, Amandeep. Um, as you know, as a child, I saw books as a means of world traveling and trying to understand what another world would like, another worldview would look like. And how do you think of that ability or the desirability of talking about somebody else? You describe your writing process as like very autobiographical, in a mode of very autobiographical. Um, but what do you think about the wonder and the world traveling that can come from trying to inhabit somebody else's life?
It's just that I'm not that kind of a writer. I mean, it's great when people do it. I love travel writing myself, love reading travel writing myself. In fact, one of my favorite writers, in some ways, mm, has been Ryszard Kapuscinski, who was a Polish journalist. Uh, he covered 27 revolutions. He was one of those who had the only ones who had a permission during the Cold War years to travel Africa, South America, and I love the way he does his journalism, and that's the kind of journalism I like to do. Is fly on the wall, like you enable the voices to speak out. You let people, you don't take away the ownership of the voice of whoever is speaking. You enable. There's a wonderful book called The Shah of Shahs. It's one of his lesser known works. It's about when the Iran revolution happened. It is an entire book constructed out of cassettes, images, conversations that were happening on the roadsides. And at the end of it, you get to see what happened in the revolution. Similarly, his most famous book, The Emperor, is of Haile Selassie. Now, that's a book in which he deliberately did not talk to any high ranking official of Ethiopia. He constantly talked to the lowest of low, but everybody who was involved in the palace, like a sweeper, a shoe shiner, a sentry. These are the smaller jobs, what are considered smaller jobs, but they, he felt, are the most authentic voices. So in any situation, what you need to do, if you are an outsider to a lot of the world, I mean, your life is just very limited, but then you need to go there and you need to see that you don't put yourself out. You don't want to make a statement on your own behalf on what is going on. You actually find the voices that are telling you the story on the ground. Even in my writing, I hardly ever go and talk to big leaders about what is happening. I'm like, the lower guys will tell, and they normally tell you the better stories. Not when I'm reporting as a journalist. Like that time, you have to, like for example, the recent story which came out on the protests. It is, I'm talking to a mix of people. But when I'm writing my book, for example, I deliberately avoided all politicians, all office holders. I'm look. You are saying the same things from the same platforms for years together. Let us see how people are receiving it, and what are they telling me about having received these stories, these words from you, these ideas from you, what is happening in their minds, that is of greater importance to me. So I think when you are not part of a situation which you are trying to talk about, you become an enabler for that situation to speak about itself. Rather, you try to take position and say, "Okay, I will tell you what is happening here." I hate that kind of journalism. In fact, or writing also. As a writer, I always feel that the reader is far bigger than me, and I am only speaking from below the reader upwards to the reader, never talking down to the reader. That is, I think, that works for me at least, And I feel when I read stories or when I read writings like that, uh, I feel that I'm able to participate in them and I'm able to recreate those situations in my hand as a reader, and I hence understand them slightly better than if somebody were to sermonize me on how something is.
Thank you, Amandeep. We've unfortunately come to the end of our time, so we can't take any more questions. But very special thank you to all the panelists, each of our panelists, Rachna, Urvashi, and Amandeep, for taking this time to share your reflections and thoughts with us. It's been a pleasure to listen to you and to think aloud with you. And I'm sure each of those questions are going to stay with all of us going ahead. I'd like to also thank the organizers of this event. Thank you for having me and for having the panelists and for having this topic and this really interesting conversation. And most importantly, thank everyone who's been listening in. I hope you found it interesting and exciting. And I hope the remaining sessions at the LitFest will also be as energizing and stimulating as this one. So thank you so much, and hand over back to you, Akanksha.
Thank you, Rupali. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all the panelists and the moderators for taking out time from their busy schedules and joining this panel. We all had a great time and we learned your firsthand experiences. So thank you so much and hope to see you all again for another LitFest edition.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rupali. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.